Good morning. My name is Mark Pearson, and I'm a professor of architecture here at College of DuPage. I'd like to welcome you all to our second spring semester event in our 2020-2021 Visiting Artists Series here at College of DuPage. This series is a collaboration between the Cleve Carney Museum of Art and the Departments of Art, Architecture, and Photography at COD. It is my pleasure to welcome and introduce today's speaker, Paola Aguirre Serrano. Paola's Twitter bio reads, sometimes architect, passionate urban designer. She describes her studio as a research and design practice that focuses on connecting communities to design and cultivating collaborative design agency. I like to think of her work as a form of design-based community organizing. In her Overton project, for example, she addresses the issues of repurposing closed Chicago public schools. This project's part installation art, part design project, part community outreach, and it's a project that serves as a catalyst to instigate design dialogue around the difficult and politically charged topic of school closures in Chicago. So is her work architecture? Sometimes. Urban design, community organizing, installation art? However you want to classify it, Paola's work uses design to bring people together. It's creative, collaborative, and deeply impactful. For those of you who are listening in the YouTube live premiere of this lecture, please feel free to put your questions in the live Q&A chat box. And Paola, welcome to COD. Thank you for spending time with us today. We are so looking forward to hearing about your work, and I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'm really excited and honored and thrilled to be virtually with you all. I feel like it's a new world. It's a different way of engaging that we all had to adapt very quickly. So I'm just grateful for the space. I'm grateful for the invitation. I'm grateful for the consideration and all the work that goes behind preparing this lecture series. I'm also excited to see the ones that are coming up. So everyone, please stay tuned. So I like to begin also with this very important approach to the work that we do at Borderless. This idea of scratching, the approach of thinking that we are offering a service, whether it's from the architectural perspective, whether it's from the civic arts perspective, whether it's from the planning perspective. I think we see ourselves and the way that we approach most of our work is through the value of collaboration. So designing with and not for creates the spirit in most of the conversations that we are able to have as part of our working communities. So today I want to talk about a few things. I'm gonna fly by through a few projects that I hope you find interesting, but also I think it's important to talk about the journey that I've had as a designer, but also the values that have been informing and shaping this practice called Borderless now. Borderless was founded in 2016. It's still a very young practice, but it has been an idea in the make for 10 years. So I love opening with this quote from Jane Jacobs, because she was not only not an architect, not an urban planner, but just a citizen that decided that it was important to fight and to push back and incorporate perspectives and decision-making processes that help to shape and inform and influence our built environment. And, a lot of the people that I work with are anyone from young people, kids that are incredibly imaginative in their visions, all the way to youth, young adults, seniors. So I feel like we really work in the spectrum of thinking how design can impact everyone's lives, and how can those make spaces and places more enjoyable and contribute to built environment that enables everyone to thrive. And we think often of like, what are the values that shape the studio? So publicness, openness, civicness. I'm going to talk about them through all the different project examples, but I want you to feel that tone also in the way that we approach the work and that I am able to present it today. A little bit of geography, just because I love maps and other shape in every shape form. I'm originally from a town called Chihuahua, which is also the largest state in northern Mexico. And I moved to Chicago, and it has been an experience that has shaped definitely my practice. But everything that happened between Chihuahua and Chicago is 10 years. And that basically is where Borderless in many ways cultivated a lot of the information that I'm going to share today in terms of practice. So the ethos behind Borderless is not only, it started only being geographic, obviously, because I have this very deep connection of my journey as a designer between the US and Mexico, but it rapidly expanded in this idea of scales, like easily understanding what happens at the scale of a person, what happens at the scale of the neighborhood, what happens at the scale of a city and regions eventually. So that ability to understand impact and relationships across scales, but also across culture. I think one of the most beautiful things that the United States has is its diversity. And how do we think of the bridges, and how do we think of the opportunities that exist and the richness that emerges out of the multicultural. We don't have to choose to be one person. We can be all of them and belong to multiple cultures, as a country that it's rooted in the richness of immigration as well, and also values and processes. I'm gonna touch about this multiple times. So I just wanted to begin with those words to set the tone. It's important to know that Borderless has been really fortunate to collaborate in other cities. We're trying more and more to expand this map into all North America, including, of course, more cities in Mexico, but also in Latin America. I feel like that spirit of my passion for public realm emerged in my experience from Mexico and Latin American countries, and I'm able to contrast and compare how public space in the US differs from public spaces in other places. So that relationship influences a lot of the work that we try to put forward. We lead with this idea of cultivating collaborative design agency. And what that means in principle is that we believe that every community has a capacity, every person has a capacity to influence their built environment. And therefore, we just sometimes it's the how do we do it? How do we get there? How do we either organize to get together? How do we learn the design techniques or tools? How do we think of what are the needs of our community? The needs of community can be met through design solutions. So we believe that Borderless is fortunate to collaborate in many communities, but oftentimes we're not from that community. So how do we create the platform for communities in their own places create the change they want to see? And we are just a tool. We are just the support. We're just constantly thinking how we design and create the scaffolding for others to do the work they want to do. Right after architecture school, I had the opportunity to practice in the public sector. So a young architect doing planning work with very, very fortunate opportunities, great mentors, but really having no idea what I was doing. And being exposed to the public, to communities, to neighborhoods in a way that I had not been trained for. So just this has amplified completely the way that I think about the impact and social infrastructure. Everything that we do, we try to prioritize our work at Borderless to be in the side of social impact, so social infrastructure, public spaces, but eventually it's not the physical space. We really want to influence what public life could be and should be for most of communities, and how does that become inclusive? This was an exhibition that asked designers from Latin America to send us their publications into an exhibition that was happening in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So it was a compendium of work that, as a school that is, at least at the time in 2010, the Harvard School of Design it's still very US centric, but we brought this very strongly perspective from Latin America. And one of the lessons learned here was the school wasn't necessarily interested at the time to talking about Latin America. We had to bring to the table the topics that we wanted to talk about as students. So this was a very early lesson on, how do we not only can, but have the responsibility to change narratives, and how do we can redefine the conversation when we feel strongly about topics that are not being reductive or not amplifying the way that we believe. As designers, I think as artists, we have the capacity to do that through multiple ways. So this is what a lot of my work started doing or focusing on when speaking about the border. I think I mentioned, like, initially the focus was the border. Geographically, I walked this line so many times in my life. This is the crossing. This is the point of crossing between El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, where one of the few things or landmarks that you see is the plaque from the International Border Water Commission. And for me, that was interesting. Why water? Why doesn't it say Homeland Security? Why doesn't it? No, it was water that was landmarking this very specific point. And I've been using mapping as a way to understand scale. I wanted to redefine the conversation about the border. How do we talk about a border that is about ecology? How do we talk about a border that is looking into other challenges, not only around crime and immigration, but we have very latent issues to solve as two countries that share resources such as water. So I just started mapping. This is the watershed map that just compares and contrasts, this relationship between the Great Lakes and all the St. Lawrence Basin system, watershed system, and the Rio Grande Bravo watershed system. So I was trying to mapping as a tool to understand. I think that will become very, very clear in some of the aspects of this presentation. And thinking of other systems like ecology and water and how cities, specifically how we design cities, and no relationship to their ecological environment. So for me here, this was like, what can Albuquerque have in common with Monterey? Because they belong to the same watershed, but they don't necessarily see themselves as part of the same water system, especially not in practice. Or how can Brownsville and Matamoros learn from, Chihuahua? Very different climates, very different populations, very different circumstances, but they both have bodies of water running through them. One has a river that has been channelized. The other one has oxbows or resacas that are bodies of water that used to be part of a river, and now the water is stagnant. Mapping as a tool, population. Again, I was just trying to understand how this territory could be read differently, how it could be interpreted differently. How does, zooming in water systems, how do we learn just by mapping that, water in countries and cities such as Ciudad Juarez and El Paso had the opportunity to reinvent the way that they want to address these challenges and resources. But these two cities have the same issue. According to studies, they're going to run out of water by 2030. Their approaches to solving that problem and their resources very different. Their policies very different. So that Juarez is just going to keep digging more wells into the ground. Extraction is the strategy. El Paso is investing in a desalination plant. There's more water that could be extracted. We just need to go deeper. But the processes and the investment to make that water portable or drinkable are incredibly expensive. So we're not necessarily thinking of like ecological strategies. We just keep defaulting to the same methods of extraction to our planet and our regions. And this is the landscapes that creates, right? That attitude to our landscape, that's what it creates. And just by documenting this and thinking, how do we bring this different types of approaches to talk with communities? I feel like all these conversations happen in national policy, and we don't necessarily find a way to bring them. So this is my hometown. This is what Chihuahua looks like from a satellite. It's very interesting because it's a mountain. It's between the mountains and the valley. So, but what I was interested is looking at what happens on the border, right? Happens at the edge of the city. And what happens is it's a lot of rural or formerly rural and agricultural land, and it's been subdivided. and it's been basically urbanized by the people that live there. Assembling teams. This is an interdisciplinary team of 17 students in 5 different universities. Mapeo was a workshop experiment that I started testing, bringing over 6 institutions, including the planning agency that I used to work for, and bringing designers, anthropologists, ecologists, planners, all students to the ground. I feel oftentimes what we lack is touching base with the crowd and understanding who are the publics that we're trying to work with. This community had seen recent investment in a community center, enjoyed in different ways, kids using spaces in anticipated ways. This was just a courtyard in between 2 buildings that the architects have very strictly said, this is a courtyard, and the kids is like, no, this is a football field now. And they will just sneak through the posts because they're small enough and they can. But how repurposing, how spaces are repurposed and live in public life looks different once people get to occupy those spaces. And working with students, I feel like this was very gratifying in a way that students from a public university got to speak with students from a private university and facilities wise, right? This is a student explaining zoning in residential commercial zoning to an 8-year-old. So that was incredibly interesting. The group is learning about demographics, like how many people in what percentage age groups are in their neighborhood. So I think for me, what was very important is to think of these students being future professionals, in having them not necessarily being trained through a formal curriculum, but by experience. Like this is what Mapeo workshops were, a space for collaboration and creative thinking. Like how do we think creatively about the ways that we engage with community, as opposed to coming to the typical town hall. I had the opportunity to work with Place Lab in Chicago, based at U Chicago. And I was incredibly lucky to work with the leadership of artist Theaster Gates. Obviously, his work has been recognized and acknowledged everywhere. And working closely with him, understanding how public critique is important and how does that become a moment and a tool for thinking collectively about spaces and places and shaping things. So I was part of this team, which was a really interesting experiment where the team had everything. It was a dream team, right? And anything that you could work, that you need to deploy a project in a community. Specifically, we're working in Washington Park in Chicago. You had a social worker, a cultural worker, an architect, an urban planner, a real estate developer. So you had a dream team to actually envision, execute, engage community. So a well-rounded team. And working in primarily the Grand Crossing in the Washington Park neighborhood, which we know there's a lot of challenges in terms of disinvestment and as a result of segregation and racism in Chicago. But it was a really interesting way, being on those spaces, learning from his practice. I really like referencing this because this was game-changing in my practice. Like, how do we think of arts? How do we think of imagination in a way that it's not necessarily a limitation, but how do we think of rethink emptiness? How do we think imagination and gaps? So this was an exhibition / activation project that I had the opportunity to co-curate. And we basically were thinking, how do we go beyond the walls of this gallery space that sits on the corner of South Prairie Avenue and East Garfield Boulevard, which is the blue building here. There were other projects in the pipeline. Now many of them have been executed or implemented, but back then there was only this corner building kind of holding all the pressure of activating that block. And we thought of as an exhibition, as an opportunity to create content that was meaningful and incremental, interdisciplinary collaborations, neighborliness, new partnerships, audience. Really were thinking, how do we get people to collaborate with each other? Artists collaborating with a street vendor across the street, architects collaborating with musicians, institutions, projects such as Southside Movie Project, that is a very academic archive and has been working very strongly about socializing that content, bring it as a projection in the facade of a muffler shop, of a former muffler shop, right? So how do you think of different scales? Again, an object, an outdoor installation, a building that is yet to be restored, and thinking of amplifying collaborations through process, artists and designers, members of the community, students and youth, and thinking of prototyping. I think something that we love is prototyping things. Sometimes a prototype is the best resource that we have to not only make connections, but also think of ways in which projects may even pivot or recalibrate strongly. This is the corner of, this is a random Tuesday. I'm saying Tuesday because I don't remember what day this was, but this was the opening night. But this is a night, a random nighttime in the corner of Washington Park on 55th and Prairie. This public life doesn't really exist in Chicago and the South Side and many places. So we really wanted to test, what does it mean? What does it look like? Bringing designers and developing installation work that wanted to think of something that is very signature of Chicago, such as the Bucket Boys, and using that as an inspiration in partnership with the sound artist, with an artist, Michael Patrick Avery, collaborated with the architects in developing this amplifying machine that lived, and then it was tested by the Bucket Boys who performed there. So a little stage situation. There was also a component about sharing the plans for future redevelopment. So all these elements were growing as the exhibition time frame was passing by. But for me, this is it, right? Like, how do you create things that are not museum quality, but they're beautiful enough and compelling enough that people feel like I belong here and I can interact with this. And so I'm going to transport us now into the border. This is Brownsville in Texas. I feel like you'll start tracking lessons learned from one place to the other. The other thing is just keep thinking, like keep in mind that my practice spans between civic arts, architecture, landscape architecture, urban design, urban planning. Sometimes a project is all of them. Sometimes a project just stays in a bucket. Which still, we try to implement many of these other elements that we learn along the way. This was a housing project, a housing development that was developed in the 40s. And you see the outlier in this picture. I love it because you can see the influence of urban renewal. These are small blocks in downtown Brownsville, Texas. And this is one insertion or one intervention that was done with a mindset of urbanism that was brought by with modernism, right? The big blocks, the big garden areas, the building in the park. And it is a housing authority project, obviously supported by the federal housing department. And it pretty much looked, this is the visit that we had at the beginning. It pretty much looked the same way, right, that the 40s. That was a positive thing. The maintenance was really good, even though the design of the structures is completely wrong. This is Brownsville. It's over 60% humidity. Imagine living in a one-story building that is in a city that is like 90 degrees at 60% humidity with no air conditioning system. So that was very challenging architecturally. I think there was this template that architecture took from place to place in this type of buildings. Yet the landscape, was doing a little bit of the work, kind of bringing shade in some of the buildings. A big issue was not understanding or not having clarity on how the public space works, right? Some of the sheds and shelters. And most of the time, the space was looking like this. There was no public life. You can see the pattern of development, very contrasting from whatever is around it. And occupied currently by a 99% Mexican or Mexican-American community. So the population most of the residents had been there for their entire life. A very strong community of women that were interested in entrepreneurship, One of the outcomes of the project was creating like a small community center where women could also learn about entrepreneurship and creating their own businesses that they already had. You know, they were cooking, they were feeding, they were starting, like clothing and sewing, and they were already entrepreneurs. They just weren't calling themselves that way. So this is what the development looked like. Very simple bars, very modern, 2 entries, and then obviously over time, the main thing that happened was the parking was being punched here and there. So everything that you see in blue, it's parking, which is crazy. And we wanted to think, what can we do? There was a lot of confusion around the public space. All the green, it was painted in green. It was actually green, but it wasn't really utilized. And this lack of understanding or having clarity how the public space could be activated, utilized. We started thinking that collectively. These were workshops that we use our tools to understand the space. We also talk about the issues. We talk about safety. We talk about crossing the streets. We talk about what are the types of gatherings that young people, that elder people had, what they do, what the activities. So we workshop a lot. And we partner with some of the residents that were helping us to come up with concepts. We had some workshops for young people, for adults. We had a small like a small showroom where we were keeping these models, and people were coming and modify them and see them, coming up with concepts. But eventually, it was just putting the tools out for residents to tell us what they want to see and how they want us to shape the space. We ended up just reshaping into the context the former blocks. And this diagram speaks very clearly about we wanted basically to reconnect, to reestablish the street grid that old towns, downtowns had already worked with. We also wanted a big park, that center of public life and neighborhood life where everyone could come together and throw their block party as opposed to being on the edges of the property. And this is how eventually all got rendered and illustrated in a central park, a community building in Pear, this idea of a paseo that could be more the cultural element of display. And there was a closed school across the street that wanted to have a conversation and speak to some of the activities on the Central Park. So we bundle all that together. And thinking of what other forms of housing could be here as opposed to just, the one story template that was done before, and how could we think of active ground floors with much more retail and other forms of housing that would be more responsive to the climate of the region. Natural ventilation, thinking of also more areas for infiltration, how the priorities of the community start taking shape. So we were just translating those, literally translating to graphics and translating them from English to Spanish, because a lot of the conversations were in Spanish. And we were just supporting the sense of pride. I think we were just being an instrument for the community to synthesize and articulate what they already had in their minds and hearts. This project's going to take us to Detroit. I'm going to accelerate the pace now because I think what you'll see is it's a similar methodology. So you'll start picking patterns, but the location, we always like to think that the location changes significantly the way that we approach things. This was a partnership with Sarah Hayash. She's a landscape architect. We submitted for a competition held by the department, the Department of Planning in the city of Detroit. We were double Dutch because I was based in Chicago. She was in Detroit, so we were double Dutching most of the time. Yeah, this is before Zoom, so it was more phone call and other means of of communication that we were not super used to. But this is another neighborhood. If you're familiar with Detroit, this is downtown Detroit. And this is a neighborhood called Morningside it's very similar to Washington Park. So we were dealing with something with conditions that were similar. The prompt from the city was, this neighborhood doesn't have parks, public space, but it has a lot of vacant lots. Can we assemble land and create parks. And also the fabric of the neighborhood, it was incredibly rich architecturally. These roofs are just so remarkable, yet you see a lot of border homes, a lot of need for basic infrastructure such as sidewalks, basic infrastructure for being able to take a walk in your neighborhood, but a lot of love at the same time. This was a park that was called Mother's Park, and there were little snippets of art and chairs and just, neighbors trying to make space for gathering. So this is some of the images from that neighborhood. There was a playground. The playgrounds that are designed obviously based on a very specific template. They have to be gated. They have to have a door, a gate, and they have to be separate because kids of certain age play in this type of playscape, and the kids of this other age play in this other type of playscape. But at the end of the day, the kids are playing on the street basketball because they don't have a basketball court, or they're playing on the fence. So they're not interested in any of the play structures that were given, probably because, there wasn't really an understanding of how the kids from the neighborhood wanted to play. So this was a very interesting exercise of observation, just trying to pick up, the little gestures or a lot of the gestures of love the neighbors have put together. We wanted to ask questions more than propose solutions. We asked, what should we know about this place? So we brought models, we brought, Post-its, boards, all these things that design offers as a tool to have conversations. We learn about, what's the best place to gather, what other problems are. We learn about flooding. We learn about, needs for spaces for teenagers. Teenagers need spaces to feel safe. And we had assumptions about you probably need a dog park. If you see, this is a very easy exercise as a preference, as a visual preference board, but our assumption of the dog park got completely scratched because that's the one that is no, we don't need a dog park here. So just challenging our assumptions, creating the materials and the tools to get those. And really thinking of design, we were thinking, where do you want this board to happen? Where do you want to sit? It's an exercise of programming at the end of the day, but it feels fun and engaging. And in many ways, for us, it was trying to have conversations, for us to have enough information to do the design work. So safety at the top of the priorities and maintenance. I think oftentimes we think of design solutions that, or what is important to consider with design solutions is how do we get over time maintained and they can stay beautiful for a long time, especially in neighborhoods that don't see a lot of investment. So we ended up proposing a ribbon. People wanted to walk, so they just wanted skills to walk. This was the main idea. How do we create a path that is continuous? How do we connect these 4 parcels just because they're separate? But how do we preserve their identity and create different kinds of play? So this is how the layout looks like. We wanted to create a pathway for neighbors to go around the different parcels, but also something that could be very conspicuous and playful and symbolic from the neighborhood, where it can absorb identity, someone can reference a place. We also wanted to prioritize safety. So there's this technique that we call pinching the corner. So at the intersection, we wanted to just modify the infrastructure, the sidewalk, the curves, in order to address both the flooding through stormwater management techniques and also the safety. Cars would feel uncomfortable, so they will slow down with reduced section of that space. And these techniques are used in many other places: bioswales, infiltration areas, expansion of curves, like ramps are important. And the lighting strategy, there was a lot of fear. There was not a lot of comfort going outside at night, and we wanted to create a path. At least the path was something that was recognizable, but also lit during nighttime. So this was a very exciting way to talk about programming too. What happens in each one of these patches? And the first one was a park that had, or the part of this parcels that had seen the most activity. People already organized themselves, but we thought, what if we bring color? What if we bring seasonal approach? And these elements that we propose just become painted and readapted every time of the season. So, fall colors versus spring colors. And this is how the place looks like today. This is what they're called today Mother's Park. And, we imagine this could be a much more protected with some kind of pavilion, our street being a little bit more close to each other. The other part was more of a social space, less activity, but more like esplanade, which would be more flexible, classes, games, seating, moving the park, like performance, something that was more open and less lawn area. So it could be a little bit more flexible. This other area could be more active. So this is where the existing playground was. We didn't propose get rid of it, more so reshape it in a way that could incorporate other types of playscapes. And also thinking of more natural playscapes and physical that would encourage physical activities, mounds, stomps. So this is how the playground looks like today. We propose a little bit more of movement and color, and especially places for the parents to sit. I think that was a big missing part of the previous one. One of the comments that came from the neighbors was, well, we bring the kids, but we're standing all the time watching them play. So just be mindful of, the kids, not all the kids come by themselves to play at the park. What are the parents doing? What are the grandparents doing? What are the siblings doing while the kids are playing? And on ecological, we wanted to think like, how can we help to infiltrate in a stronger way? So proposing a meadow, thinking of, what other types of furnishing and what type of planting, how can we bring color? How can we think of landscapes or proposing a planting that could be more resilient? So the palette of flowers like lavender and sunflowers that are more resistant, but also they have capabilities to repair soil and stabilize soil. So there were some aspects about thinking of the landscape not being a very, it wouldn't be high maintenance and having a pathway. So that's what the plan was. It was a very simple move, and we got to discuss it. This is one of my favorite photos of this project. It was a competition. I said that we didn't win. But this was one of the more remarkable moments. If you've ever been to a town hall, this is not what a town hall looks like. Usually, you don't sit around a circle to talk to your neighbors. For me, that break of hierarchy, that talking or speaking with each other in a way that we were discussing design. And these are all designers. This is not one designer. This is all designers talking about ideas and community weighing in. So this is one of my favorite photos and moments from that project. We did win the popular vote. There was a jury that selected the winner project, but we won the popular vote or whatever that counts. I feel like that was a really incredible experience. That fact that we were able to plan with neighbors and decide that the park is supposed to go. And just all influences this last project that I want to talk about. And I think Creative Grounds just summarizes, brings everything together that at Borderless we believe in. And we use, again, I said at the beginning, I use maps as a way to understand territory, influences, relationships. And I also think there is a power in the map. Even though it's very geographic, there's a power in the map for imagining and constructing worlds. So like world making and imagining, others have done it. I don't need to introduce this map, but I think the audacity of Buckminster Fuller and like, there's other way to project. Yes, and these are some of my favorite drawings from James Corner, who's also the author of that quote. Thinking of other ways of mapping. When we say mapping, we don't necessarily reference to tracing. And he talks very clearly in that text. Mapping is imagining. It's imaginative. It's an imaginative exercise. And this is some of the beautiful like collages and artwork that he presented as part of taking measures across the American landscape. But it's also the mapping paired with the public space. So that how do you use public space interventions in order to just invite others to imagine with you? I feel like as designers, we are well trained and we're versed in our world and our internal training about mapping and inventing and creating, but how do you create a scaffolding for inviting everyone around you to imagine? I think especially our most impacted communities struggle with that capacity. And how do we think as designers, how do we contribute for those capacities of imagination to resurface in very strong ways? This is another map. I just love the idea of shifting things and thinking of other ways of looking at space. Obviously, I mentioned my interest in South America, but this idea of challenging conventions and paradigms. It's a prime effort that we do in every project. How do you, the question in place, is there another way? And the answer is yes. And then is the how. How do you achieve the other way? And also thinking, you know, I often feel like architecture does a really good job at training us in a way that it's very focused on the hardware. If we take the analogy of IT and technology, the hardware, we're building hardware all the time. We're not necessarily building the software. And I think that's where the invention oftentimes is. If we redesign, if we think enough and collectively about how do we change processes or how do we design processes together, we get into other types of results or impact that is different from just enabling spaces to be built. So I'm very invested not only in shaping spaces, but contributing to see if there are other ways to organize how we occupy that space. So this is our this is the last project. This is a collaboration of multiple years, focused on the south side of Chicago primarily, and it all comes from this series of maps where. You know, we're all familiar with the community areas of Chicago. We're all familiar now, even more than before, of the level of segregation and racism that has been perpetuated through multiple systems. So living our communities of color, our Black and Brown communities, concentrated in the South, concentrated in the West, and therefore reflecting in the type of quality of neighborhoods. And this is just a legacy, right? This was not designed. This didn't happen yesterday or a decade ago. It's in a legacy of racist policies and inequities that have been shaping for decades the way that these neighborhoods look like. And one of the results of that, and it's the focus of this project is closed schools. So when I learned about it in 2015, the 2013 closings have happened already. And I was just imagining as a designer and as someone that had worked in public service before and worked on the ground with an institution such as Chicago, is there anything we can do? And obviously the most impacted schools were in Black and Brown neighborhoods. They were concentrated in communities that have seen systemic disinvestment for decades. So oftentimes in the practice, what we do is ask questions more than generating answers. And one of the questions here is, well, don't you suppose to add more resources to the under-resourced? So closing schools was taking resources and obviously quantifying that, like, okay, if we need to make a case, this is the planning brain, right? If we need to make the case for reinvestment, like, let's talk about numbers. So 45 schools, we did extensive research and understanding the building area, the acreage, summing up 3 million square feet that you just don't, because you don't see them together, because they're across 25 neighborhoods in different shapes and forms. But once you take a closer look, can you imagine what does it feel to walk in your neighborhood and look at a school that has been closed and looks like this? They're beautiful buildings. Oftentimes, they're buildings that were all schools have very intentional designs. So we like to think, what could be the next life of the school? Buildings that were historic. So we started doing that, reimagining. So this is the same building. This is West Pullman School. And not only reimagining the building per se, again, this pursuit of the public space, the public life, how would that look like? And that's how Creative Grounds was started as an initiative that wants to elevate art, design, and architecture as tools for inclusive processes. In this case, it's dedicated to the closed public schools But there are many avenues and many frameworks in which this can work. We just happen to focus on something that we thought it was evidence of a very, very strong inequity in mapping, really understanding what schools were closing, what schools were being repurposed, who was buying them, doing this in an analog and digital way. So this is our studio, just having an inventory. So this is almost like scientific research, data research, and thinking of the policies, right, that could be influenced by this work. So we all know how adaptive reuse works in buildings. Well, let's pair it. Let's push the bar a little more and talk about programming that is about entrepreneurship and innovation, wealth building, supporting local entrepreneurs. How does this become a generator or amplifier of public life in the neighborhood? Schools in general are community hubs. So once you take the educational component of it, something else is being taken away from the heart of these communities. And this is a way in which we operate often. Like, we don't make a plan. We more so create a framework, something that can be revisited in multiple ways and has multiple points of entry. We've done this through exhibition work, installation work, just trying to bring visibility to this in multiple places, Jane Addams' Whole House, and really looking at the character and history of this buildings. And doing the inventory. It was very, very difficult to find all this information in an legible and accessible way. And obviously access to information is everything in the 21st century. So we started also prototyping. We wanted to see what it look like on the ground. So learning about the history of the school, Anthony Overton, on the corner, or like on 49th Street between Indiana and Prairie Avenues, in the heart of Brownsville, learning that was named after Anthony Overton, and a very significant, prominent entrepreneur in the Black community, not only successful from the business perspective, but it was a civic leader owning one of the most prominent newspapers in the Black community. The school was designed by Perkins and Will, built in 1963, understanding the context of that time, civil rights movements, like the aspiration of schools, just thinking of all the information that went into designing this building, learning about the parents of the architecture, thinking how the architecture helped us to design a process for community to come together, understanding the broader neighborhood, and just imagining. Like, it was so daunting. The problem was so daunting that we said, okay, we know all this information. We know that this is something that needs to be made visible. So I've drawn this map hundreds of times, and one day we just put it on top of the model and say, well, why don't we put Overton on the Chicago map by putting the map of Chicago on the grounds of Overton? And that's what we did. So this was an installation that was done in collaboration with multiple people. It was about learning. It was about speaking about, the sense of loss, but also of like what can be done, walking the building with multiple voices. So it's gathering and convening and gathering again. And this was an installation that is very dear to us because it became almost like a gesture. And it just enabled other activities, inviting more designers, inviting students, just almost elevating the history of what had happened here. And the work, it just takes multiple forms and shapes. So many hundreds of people have work in the spaces, and this is a building that is not up to code whatsoever. We work in the spaces that we can, interior, exterior. Anyone that knows, how to hold a brush can come and work with us. Sometimes they're tools. Sometimes it's just something very simple, such as helping to distribute food to neighbors, especially last year during COVID, during the rise of COVID and civil unrest. And just imagining what other ways of gathering and collective learning can be enabled through the space. So I'm gonna just play a short video here.
There's only a few things that impact everyone. right? Parks, beach, lake, but schools is one of those things. It impacts everyone, if you're a kid, if you're an adult. And so when Chicago Public Schools announced that they were closing the schools and then ultimately selling the schools, I thought that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, not only to acquire some pretty incredible real estate, but to have a real impact on community, the same way that a school once did.
We are at former Anthony Overton Elementary School, future of the Overton Business and Technology Incubator. So I started doing research about the closed Chicago Public Schools that closed in 2013, and I thought it was an important call for designers like myself to have a response. The question in place was, if they're not schools anymore, what are they becoming? How can we collectively participate in this process of revitalizing closed schools?
We are big fans of Paola and what she's been doing here at Anthony Overton.
Repurposing the public schools that have been closed and putting them back into practice as a utility for the communities that they live in is really important.
Photographers, civic tech folks, other artists, designers, architects, students, everyone could be represented in this building.
It's really great to see designers, architects, artists working in one space collaboratively.
This school is an architectural gem and absolutely, needs to be utilized for some public purpose.
Using this beautiful architecture in the way that the classrooms work with natural light, but also with the visual connectivity across the spaces, gave us a really good framework to organize folks to think of their own theme, think of their own focus, but also expressing something that they felt important to talk about in terms of places like schools that are becoming something else.
Just trying to be efficient and effective with materials and, land and our earth. It's a wise thing to do.
That's why this idea of interior architecture, repurposing everything on the inside rather than creating more and more buildings that will eventually become, again, underutilized.
And I feel like old buildings kind of tell a story that new buildings can't.
A big part of it is just reinvesting in the communities because these are large vacant buildings and they really need reinvestment just to reactivate the community and make the whole city a better place to live, pretty much.
We've been thinking about what it means as architects for us to have a kind of responsibility to our communities and how we can use design to think about bringing people together.
If you work in this project, is walking the talk, is really practicing some activism. And to me, that was probably the first time in which I do something like that. And I was like, this is a big opportunity. I have to be part of it.
And being a graduate of the Chicago public school system and, being a resident of this community, it's something that I, is personal, absolutely.
We really believe that schools are the center of communities and that they're places for neighbors and friends to come together in new ways.
Everyone has the opportunity to make an impact in the built environment if we understand that we have the capacity and the power to do so. Each one of us has that capacity and can be amplified if it's done collectively.
We're sparking fires. I think designers, our ways of advocating are really creating open doors or open door policies in a way that allows people that have something to say that might not get to say it all the time, they now have a space that they can do that.
I just want to finish, there's a website, creativegrounds.org, where more materials, more recent projects have been documented. We've been going to other schools, Woods Academy, and working with other community organizations. We've been continuing to work at Overton and other, amplifying the topics, climate and cultural resilience, talking about climate change, and thinking how data, such as hard data, can come into spaces in a much more important way. So I want to stop here. This is actually a slide of work in progress. We're trying to define, this is the first time I show this because I think we're trying to define how we become more responsive and committed and are accountable in the things that we say we're invested in at Borderless. So this idea of shaping through values and principles, right, and process. So how do we think of justice and resilience and agency and creativity as the core of that? So I'm gonna stop there and just welcome some of the questions, Mark, that some of the students so kindly send your way.
Thank you again so much for being here with us and for sharing your work. I think our students are going to find your work so inspirational, and so just thank you for sharing your practice with us, and I really appreciate that. We have a few questions that students have sent in, and I'm curious to hear some of your thoughts on these. The first question is kind of on the lines of thinking about non-traditional design careers. And so your practice operates slightly outside of the traditional boundaries of an architectural practice or of an urban design practice to some extent. And we had a few students who were curious to know more about your practice model, but also if you had advice for students that might want to use their architectural education in non-traditional ways.
Oh my God, that's always a hard one. There's no template. I just have to lead with that. There's no template, right? I feel like what I've shared is something that's come from opportunities to practice both in public sector, working for government, working private practice. I worked for a private design office for multiple years. I feel like understanding those processes and systems helped me both to advance my skills as a designer, but also be critical, right? Is this how I want to practice? And, there's no one pathway. I would say, no matter what, students have the opportunity to get so many experiences, right, in the field. And the best thing I would recommend is find a circle of friends and mentors that can constantly help you to shape your work. I think for me, the commitment to collaboration comes from that space of vulnerability. Like, I don't do anything alone. If you see all the portfolio projects, or most of the portfolio projects at Borderless, they're all in collaboration. And what that does is creates automatically a system of accountability. I'm not taking the decisions alone ever. And that's something that, could be applied to students. I think the training, the artistic training and the architectural training is a lot about, it's rooted in a lot of individual work. And honestly, when you are practicing, is very, very, very few opportunities that you'll have to create the impact at scale when you operate as an individual. So, and that's not easy. It's not an easy path. There needs to be, like the practice of not only tolerance, but understanding, what are the things that you could contribute? What are the things that you don't necessarily have expertise and need someone else to complement that? I think the ambition and the audacity of projects comes from multiple minds and mindsets coming to respond to one thing. So I would say collaborate as much as you can. It's like learning how to dance, right? If you ever take dance lessons, the first thing your instructor will tell you, never dance with the same partner too many times, because you just pick their habits and you get used to the one person. So collaborate as much as you can. It's an exercise, and every person is different, and therefore you'll learn how to adapt. You'll learn how to listen. You'll learn how to just be more responsive. I would say that no matter where you go, if you practice for a firm or with a firm, if you practice on your own, just try to collaborate as much as you can.
Thank you. That's really great advice for students. We had another line of questions that were sort of about a few questions that were kind of in the same range of the importance of like either preserving history or revealing history. And the idea that it was interesting to me that, Anthony Overton was a successful entrepreneur, and when a school closes, does that history just disappear? And so I guess your thoughts about the importance of like kind of either preserving or revealing, and I think your work does a lot of that.
Yeah. So, one of the things I would learn when doing all this research about closed schools and having conversations with folks that would walk the hallways with us, it was one of the first things that CPS, Chicago Public Schools, did was remove the naming signage from the schools. And that was, that's an act of erasure immediately, right? So removing a name and then the renaming happened, and, because we don't have policies and protocols that support keeping that, right? It just made me feel like we need to preserve this. There needs to be an acknowledgement that all these generations were trained here, went to school here, but also a lot of the schools were named after Black and brown notorious characters. So we wanted to elevate that specifically. This is like year 3 at Overton, but I still there's a new book I'm reading that just came out last year that, tells the story and the life of Anthony Overton. And one of the things that popped to me in that story, in that personal story, that was that his wife was a very instrumental part of his business practice. And, this building was not called the Overtons, it was called Anthony Overton. So some of those nuances about who gets recognized because they get visibility. But on the other hand, I think understanding how to elevate legacy, elevating and making his story more visible, definitely we would like to do this with every one of the schools that were named after definitely a black or brown person, but also just going to the point of closure, right? Like how do you prevent closure from becoming erasure? And I think that has to be a very intentional part of the work.
So the last kind of questions were in the lines of kind of the question of what can design do? Your work focuses so much in neighborhoods that have seen decades of disinvestment, and so how can design really try to address these really tricky and multi-generational challenges in a way?
I think expanding, and the last diagram was trying to convey a little bit of that, or create a theory around that, or a framework for practice, right? So we've been prescribed very strongly what architects can and cannot do. And that I think is due to the way that our training works. What we've been trying is to demonstrate that, number one, you don't have to do it all. You don't have to know how to do it all. More so, find the partnerships that help you to expand the work in the ways that you want to create impact. One of the requirements to come to Overton and work at Overton in installations or any other activation project was you need to collaborate. If you want to do a solo show, there's so many spaces to do that. There's plenty of those. If you want to work here, I think we have to align with the value of collaboration.
Well, thank you again so much for sharing your work. Your work is so inspirational, and we appreciate you spending time with us here at COD to talk about your practice. Thanks to all of you who joined us from home and those who contributed questions in the chat. This lecture will be archived on our website at theccma.org. Just look for the Visiting Artist Series link. Our next Visiting Artist event will be a panel discussion with Aaron Wiersma, John Sabraw, and Terry Conrad on Thursday, April 22nd at 11 a.m. We look forward to seeing you then.